Hello, welcome everyone. This is another Tuesday, another API review session. If you're watching this live right now, stop doing this and go watch Build. Build is way more interesting than we are, but somebody has to build the tech that you see at Build, so we will just keep working because we're not paid to watch Build, we're paid to build software. So here we go. So I think the first time you're gonna skip probably because Mihal isn't here. Then let's go over to the other one here. Yeah, so apparently Cuba can hear me, but they can't hear and I think I don't know what the problem is. Oh, routing. Here we go. The chat mic should go. Somebody say something.
Something.
Yep, I think it's working now. For some reason, the chat was excluded from the broadcast mix, so it should work now. Yeah, please keep going.
Yeah. So basically about like the histogram instrument itself will have the advice property, which is can return the advice. It's nullable. So if nobody specifies the advice, I mean, so it will be null. But if somebody created the histogram using the create histogram inside the meter and passing the advice object there, so this will be used as the advice for the histogram bucket. Yeah, this is mostly it. Of course, I mean, as I mentioned about like this is part also about like open telemetry specification. I mean, like it's coming from the specification of open telemetry.
One question I have is the way the APIs are structured right now.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like you have to, if you want to specify tags, for example, you must specify a unit and a description. And now in order for you to provide an advice, you have to provide name, unit, description, tags, and advice. Is that what we want?
Yes.
Why? I mean, like, it seems description, for example, would be completely orthogonal to whether you want tags or advice.
If you see the first overload, I mean, like it takes the name and unit description. I mean, and we have the default parameters here. So, I mean, like if somebody need to provide the full information for the histogram, so they will need to have the ability to provide the name and the unit and description and tags or advice.
Yeah, let me rephrase
So,
this. So I think what I would have expected here is we modify the existing method and basically mark everything as non-optional. And then when we add this method here, we mark everything after name optional. Because that's what normally what we've said, the way we version overloads of methods that take optionals. Because otherwise, the problem is that, as I said, now you want to create a histogram with just advice, and now you're forced to pass in your description and tags, which you.
okay. And okay, so your proposal is to have like optional parameters for this after the histogram or what?
Yeah, I mean, normally what I would have expected, if we have a method where we basically say, everything after the second parameter or something is optional, when you add more things to it, what you do is you take the previous overloads, you remove all optionality, and then
Okay.
on the new one, you mark everything optional after the second one again. So that it's never ambiguous which one you refer to. But if you want to pass in, the fifth argument at some point, you don't have to specify all the other ones before, right? Point of optional parameters.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, yeah, we can change
But
this.
we haven't done this before, right? So that's why I was asking. So when you look at the existing two methods, create histogram, the first one, name is required, everything else is optional. And then we added the
Right.
other one that added tags. And there we already have the thing where now if you want to specify tags, you have to specify everything else. That seems weird to me. I would have expected there for us to basically go to the first overload, mark unit and description as required. And then in the new one, now we mark unit and description as optional. That you can just call create histogram name, comma, tags equal blah, right? Or tags colon something. And I think we should do this now because otherwise it becomes a bit harder to use.
Yeah, this would be fun. Yeah.
um, Here, let me say, right, so we made thing mark parameters as required. Let me say alt.
feel like we EB never the middle one.
I mean, I don't have an objection.
Actually,
doing
even
that.
the old one.
Do that.
I feel like what we said was to just make the old ones disappear. Of course, this one doesn't have an overload that has no defaults, like that has all the defaults removed. I'll believe that we had a reason for that at the time. Which would just be create histogram of name.
So then, you're suggesting adding one overload that just has name, or are you saying just EB never all the existing ones?
The guidance we have is once you have 2 or more defaulted parameters, you should make a simplified overload that has eliminated all of the defaults to show the minimal signature. In this case, that would be create histogram of name. So then we would have create histogram of name, and then the 3 parameter one would be EB never, the 4 parameter one would be EB never, and then the 5 parameter one with 4 defaults would be the only other visible overload.
Yeah, I can. I never remember what the All right, so and is you cool with that?
So one of the things that came up in the API discussion in GitHub was like once I create a histogram advice object, I'm always going to have to pass in the explicit boundaries. But is it possible that in the future, different advisory data will be accepted as part of the spec, and maybe I want to pass that data but not pass an explicit boundaries data?
Sorry, this part. Can you say it
So
again?
the one of the issues that kind of came up in passing in the GitHub discussion was, why is this a mandatory parameter on the histogram advice class itself rather than an optional data property on histogram advice? Like why is it not nullable, for instance?
The advice itself is not nullable?
No, the explicit bucket boundaries property on the advice class. Do you expect that the advice class will ever get new data added to it?
No, I mean, like, anyone need to use the advice class has to provide the boundaries. Otherwise, it's not useful at all. So why we need to have it nullable here?
Because in the future, is it possible that the advice will have, we'll say, like, instead of telling you the explicit boundaries, I want to tell you some other piece of data as advice, as advisory data,
like,
but I don't care about the boundaries.
Yeah, the whole discussion is in the future, even like the whole discussion is to have like tags with the advice, but the boundaries is one crucial thing that you have to provide for the advice. So I'm not expecting, like, to get like a different kind of like data structures different than this list.
Okay, because I'm looking at the OpenTelemetry spec right now, and the OpenTelemetry spec does not list this as a mandatory parameter. Which means that the OpenTelemetry spec actually leaves open the possibility that there could be different advisory parameters in the future where you do not have to specify the bucket boundaries.
Oh. Yeah, I'm fine to make it nullable, but but it will be weird today about like if somebody can create advice and passing none for it. I mean, like,
well, it's weird today, right? But like we're presumably making something that's future-proof.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this would be fine for me.
On that note, I mean, presumably you capture the boundaries into some collection, right?
Right.
Well, yeah, so we probably should expose that as a, I don't know, at least as an iRead only. Other than as, I think you should take an iNumable, probably persist it in collection or writing, probably even iRead.
Why it has to be a read-only collection? I mean, why iNumable is not enough here?
Well, the problem with iNumable is like if anybody wants to take the count, now they have to do gymnastics to get the count, right? If they want to index into the buckets, right, they have to again persist it into something. Like to me, iNumable kind of means that, you know, it's computed on demand.
Yeah.
Which in your case wouldn't be, right? It's a persisted.
Yeah, this would be fine. I mean, read-only collection would be fine.
Does that make it difficult to pass an array in? Because that's probably going to be the most common data type, right?
Well, we wouldn't change the parameter, but even if we did, I mean, every array implements iRead only collection of key, right?
Well, iRead only collection does not mean the collection's immutable. It just means you, through this very specific interface, can't mutate it.
Right, but it's just being read in as an IEnumerable and then drained into a new thing as the property.
Oh, because you're making a copy, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, even then, it doesn't change anything, right? I mean, like you can still, I mean, if you just store it as, you know, if you just take the array as is and store it for, if you expose as an iEnumerable, you can pass it away as easily as you can with an iRead only list. So just returning it as an iRead only list doesn't change anything.
Well, that's why I was trying to figure out like why restrict it.
But so we're leaving the parameter weakly typed, but we're boosting the type of the property off of IEnumerable.
Oh, yeah, yes. Okay, got it. Okay. If somebody reads it after the fact.
Yeah.
Yep, that makes sense.
And then you said you want to have it optional, or like, do we change it or leave it as is?
I think it makes sense to be non-nullable in the constructor because we only have a constructor that takes this one thing. Why are you building it if you're not providing data? But it sounded to me like Levi thinks the property should be nullable, unless null and empty are supposed to be treated similarly, in which case we could just say in the future when there's another kind of thing, we just have an empty collection for the bucket boundaries. But I don't know if null and empty are supposed to be the same thing.
But that was my concern, right? Like if we promote this as a constructor parameter, it means you have to pass something in, even if you don't care about it in the future.
In the current version.
Sure.
In the event there becomes a second property, the second constructor would say both things are null, or both things are nullable, and then maybe throw a like, why'd you pass me null? This makes no sense.
I think I understand now. Like, are you suggesting not having a constructor parameter and just having either a get set or get init?
I mean, there was commentary in the GitHub thread about that Git init might not work with really down level compilers, but use a modern compiler, I guess, that understands it.
Well, regardless of init, but I guess you're suggesting not having constructors and just having properties that you can set, right? Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's slightly better because otherwise you just have you always have to add them in pairs. Otherwise, right? If you add another thing, at the minimum you have to add an overload to the constructor, also expose the property. If you just go with properties, then you only ever have to add one.
Well, I will point out Framework Design Guidelines, section 8.3.2, collection properties do not provide settable collection properties. So it says that our correct design here, if we're getting rid of it in the constructor, would just be we expose list of T bucket boundaries and add range into it.
I mean, do not expose settable collection properties does not preclude init collection properties. But ultimately, like this is an options property back. Ultimately, right?
I'm just
I think for collections, I can kind of understand why we have that guideline, but like I think for those kind of things, it makes sense to set the entire thing.
Fair enough. I'm just pointing out what got written down years and years ago is that collection properties should be mutable, not settable.
No,
Yes.
as I said, like I know what it is. I mean, the idea back in the day was you have an object model where the owner of the collection monitors the collection, and then if you add to it as a side effect, something else happens. Those things are very complicated to do if you set the entire collection, because now you have to diff the contents or something, right? So they said, no, as a general pattern, we don't do that. We just always expose collections. And if you ever have to, for example, add the monitoring later, you can, because you own the type. But I think in this case, it's like, that's not going to happen. As Diva said, this is just a pure options bag. And I think it makes sense to set the entire boundaries as one thing, because presumably you have like 5, 6, 10 or something like that, right? It's a small number of items you're going to set here. It's going to be like 5,000 items. I mean, regarding init, I'm not sure. I think all you need for init to work is, I think, the latest language version. I don't think it from targeting net standard.
Yeah, you have to add also some empty type. I don't remember the name of it, but we got some pushback from other users to use this init because some people still stick on C# 7.3 and they need to continue doing that in .NET Framework. So it would be better to avoid init if possible.
I mean,
I don't really see the downside of that in this case. Like, you could set, like, you know, even with the constructor, even with the init, like, you can set this thing to a list and mutate it to your heart's content afterwards. I mean, you wouldn't. Hopefully you don't. But, like, it's not really protecting you from much in it versus set.
I mean, I agree with you on this one. I think that, I mean, I'm fine with just keeping it as set. I would just say, as a general principle, I don't like the idea of limiting ourselves to 7.3 for down level stuff, because as Steven recently pointed out, it's a losing thing. Like we add more and more support for things that we want to use for low level stuff, whether it's span or other things, and you just can't be in a world where we have to use C# 7.3. Just have to say, sorry, if you're down level, you have to bump the language version and live with the fact that not everything is going to work.
Yeah, but unfortunately, our documentation is not saying that. So,
I mean, our documentation says
the documentation saying that if you are using other version, I mean, after 7.3 on with .NET Framework is not supported. So, yeah.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, like, I think as a reality, that's kind of where we are, right? If you look at all the other stuff we have been doing recently, you have to use C# latest in order to use it. You have basically said, yeah, we're going to use it anyway. And I think that would be in the same bucket. I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, we don't want to use init here, so it's a non-problem. But I would say if you wanted to use init here, I would do it regardless of what that means for 7.3. I don't think we want to live in a world where we constrain ourselves purely because of down level for language version. I mean, we may have to change the documentation in this case, but I mean, we haven't really changed anything in how this technology works, right? It was always the case that you can use the latest compiler for older versions. It just means not every API is going to be there, so certain language features won't work, or you have to. And that's going to be the reality moving forward as well. But yeah, we have given people conflicting messages. You've also said, like, if you're library author and you target net standard 2, please nullable annotate your library, which requires you to be at least in C#, what is it, 12 or whatever. So it is not entirely clear. All right, so then so where are we leading then? We just remove the constructor and make it get set, is that it? And presumably not setting it is the same as setting it to empty, so it should not be nullable then?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
From the general design principles in all of the metric stuff based on OpenTelemetry, Tarek, are null and empty the same thing, or are they different?
Yeah, it depends on the consumer of that. I mean, it will end up depending on how OpenTelemetry is going to use this information. So it's up to the consumer to decide about what is the difference between null and empty.
No, unfortunately, it's up to you right now.
For this case specifically, I mean, it will be the same, because having empty buckets, I mean, it's exactly the same. Have no buckets.
One question I had is, I'm sure we talked about this earlier. So the histogram currently exposes the advice as a property. So are these histogram things sticking around? Is there a problem with things that are mutated after the fact?
No, I mean, it's not mutated after the fact, but it will stick around, yes.
Well, I'm saying, I mean, right now with the design, you could, right? You create a histogram, you get back a histogram of T. Histogram of T as an advice property, so you dot into advice dot, explicit boundaries, and now you can set it again. Is going to be a problem?
Yes, I mean, I don't think we need to mutate the advice after creating the histogram, because I'm expecting the OpenTelemetry it's just reading this value. Maybe it's reading this value once and cache it or do something with it.
No, I understand that might not be useful. I'm saying that if we make it a get set property, that's the behavior that we have by default, unless change the setter and check some boolean that says, I don't know, and you would set it, but basically the whole frozen thing, where we say after you call create histogram, you no longer get to set.
Yeah.
Like JSON serializer options does today.
I mean, that's the downside with get set. It's if you want to control when things can be set and when not, that's a bit.
Yeah, we can decide about the behavior. I mean, we can have get and set, and we can make set throw if somebody reset it again. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying. I'm basically asking, what is the behavior that we want here? I would expect after you call create histogram, setting it should probably be.
Right. I mean, so that we want, after creating this advice and setting the bucket boundaries, I mean, we want to avoid mutating this after that.
I mean, I'm just saying, init will give you that.
yeah, exactly.
Well, assuming that the collection itself, contents can't be mutated, yeah.
Yeah, don't do that. I mean,
which would go back to taking IEnumerable in a constructor parameter and not exposing it as a mutable collection.
Right.
Yeah. So why does the histogram object, why does the advice object need to be exposed at all through a public property? Would someone actually use this information?
The aggregator need to access it, right? Whoever aggregating the data from this histogram need to know the advice.
Oh, because the implementation's not in the histogram itself. It's in
right.
You're passing this object around.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
just hold it. So I guess in that case, I guess then, yeah, that's part I hate. I guess at that point, it would be bad to have a setter that would drain the passed in collection and copy it, right? That would be not a good behavior. So I think doing that in a constructor is probably.
We're back to what we started with.
Yeah, it looks like it.
We're back to what we started with, not because it's, in my mind, like we're making compromises on the API because we don't know how to make the implementation behave how we want it to behave. And that strikes me as a poor compromise.
Wait, I'm just thinking about ergonomics. Why did we move away from just get set? Like, it seems easy. So, why do we need a constructor?
So a few things on this one. So if you have a property that is get set and it's a collection, one problem is I can set it to a list of T, right? And then I can hold on to the list of T, right? So now I'm adding to the list of T, which now means at the time I assigned the property and passed it into the create histogram method, you're now after the fact basically mutating the contents of the collection. And then the other problem that you have is if you expose like normally when we have these option bags, you pass them into something, and then the option bag is used to construct the thing, but then the thing itself doesn't give you back the options back. So you don't have this problem that, well, what happens now if you get the thing that you just constructed and you mutate the options after the fact, right? But in this case, that's exactly what happens because you pass an advice. The advice is exposed as a property later on the constructed object. So what happens if you mutate either the contents of it or you just assign it to something else, right? And so,
well, it's the same problem.
It's both the same problem, which is.
But you can always mutify the contents. So like, why?
No, you cannot.
Like, just make it easy.
No, but you cannot, right? So like, if you have the original design, you take an IEnumable, the implementation copies the IEnumable into, let's say, an array, exposes said array, so you don't get to mutate the thing after the fact. Then.
So this is always
the T is generally int.
I would expect to do it, yeah.
Yeah.
And given that it's get only, you can't set it to something else, and because it copies it to mutate the contents.
I mean,
so
you can
it copies into the constructor into another IEnumerable. Are we not exposing the property now? I heard that.
No, I would still expose it because you, as Tarek said, I mean, my understanding is the histogram doesn't do anything with the advice. It's the consumer that does something with it. So you want to have a public API for the consumer.
Is it important that we copy, like, for real, or are we just being like super, super careful for no?
I mean, that's the general behavior, right? Because if you pass in data to another object, if the other object is supposed to own the collection, then we drain you, especially when you take an IEnumable.
I mean, if you just make it a get set on the class, it makes it very clear that, like, yeah, just like don't mutate it.
Well, I guess
I don't think that makes it clear at all.
I mean, that goes back to what Levi said. I don't think of this as an implementation detail. This is a public API question. Like, and the question is, after you created the histogram, can you mutate the buckets? If the answer is yes, then either design will work, right? If the answer is no, you shouldn't, well, then the design that is currently on the screen is probably the one I would do, because that's the only one where the public API can express the notion that after you created the histogram, the buckets are read-only. You go with get set.
We could also do it with a frozen collection.
Yes, we could do that too, but that's a bit more, involved.
It's very heavy.
Yeah,
I feel like the defensive copy is like super unnecessary.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Stefan here. Like, the histogram object right now exposes tags as a first class property, and it is mutable. Like, cast it back to a list of T and party on it, have fun. So like, maybe we're just overthinking this.
So the tags is
I want to say
exposed
about
IEnumerable, but is really a list.
Yeah.
But just to tell about like histogram, I mean, usually, libraries or apps will create it just once. I mean, like in the whole cross life. So copying the collection or the buckets at that time is not a problem. I mean, like it will happen once and that's it. So, but I prefer to be in safe side about like, copying it making is read only. I mean, nobody can mutate it. It's better than just opening the door for anybody to play with it.
Constructors are just terrible ergonomics for like options bag kind of thing. Like, you know, if there's some like random subset of advice that you want to set in the future, constructors are terrible.
Why?
Because like you end up having to pass in null, right, for like a bunch of values, like positional arguments for just like a grab bag of options. It's just not ideal,
I mean, you
right?
wouldn't do that, right? You would basically do what we do with the create histogram method itself, right? You would basically have instead of required parameters instead of optional parameters, and you would follow the same pattern there. I mean, you more.
But these are all optional.
Well, yeah, but like I mean that's basically how you end up with just the create histogram method, where only ever one is visible, everything else is hidden, and only ever one has everything marked as optional. And then this way you can add to it, and you always just, you know, comma and then property, or, you know, parameter name colon value, right? Which is virtually the same as using init. Just the problem with the ergonomics, as you said, is a little bit that people don't know they can do that there's some downside with, you know, optional parameters, but in terms of what you have to do, it's more or less the same. I think the big problem for me with properties is the get set semantics of, you know, when can you mutate and when can you not, right? As long as people intuitively understand where that is, it's fine. But I think the problem with some of the stuff here is that you create these things, you hold on to them, and then, you know, it's not that people want to mutate after the fact, is that, you know, they don't know what after the fact means. Like after the, you know, what is the fact here? Create histogram is the fact, maybe, but, you know, depending on where else data goes, you may inadvertently change things too late, but then you have threading issues, and it's still, you know, because of multi-threading latency, it might be okay for now, but then we speed things up and suddenly you have a race condition and shit breaks, right? So that's kind of the concern I would have with allowing that after the creation.
I feel like, especially with the get set, right? If you're modifying the thing after you set it, like it ought to be because you know it was copied, and like even then, I just don't think the defensive copy is saving real developers from real pain. I guess the upside is this isn't an API you call a lot, so right, like you're only setting up the histograms probably at the start of your app. So I guess we don't have to worry about the perf. So
yeah, I mean, the perf is not an issue here. As I mentioned about like creating a histogram, it will be done for the library with just once more. So
right.
I prefer to stick to the constructor and have just read only return collection from the property.
Okay, I just saying I don't think the setting without a defensive copy is as scary as you guys think it is, but I think it's okay. Get set makes sense for a thing where everything's optional, and
well, I would say if you do get set, I don't think you get to make copies.
Right, I agree.
Because it seems really weird that if you set a property that happens to be a collection, suddenly that copies. That seems like a perf trap. But I think it's okay to say you have a parameter that takes 9 enumerable. Especially when you look at the API right now, it seems kind of obvious that the thing copies.
Not necessarily, especially since it's the exact same type that you're exposing on the property.
I would say what you're looking at is not the same, but what I'm looking at is I look at I read only list of T explicit bucket boundaries, and the constructor takes 9 enumerable. That's what I'm saying. To me, if you have a mismatch in type, it kind of communicates that the thing drained it into an I read only list. But yeah,
that does make it more clear. Yeah, if they're different types.
But
I honestly think like literally no one is going to be like reusing collections or mutating these collections after they pass it to the constructor. Like 0 people. But I think that's okay.
Yeah, no, I agree with Stefan. Like it's in practice, no one's going to run into this. Like we're designing for a problem that is going to affect probably one person total on the entire planet. Maybe. So
yeah, I would
we
care and have opinions if the constructor is going to say things like the collection can't be empty, or the collection can't have values outside of a particular bounds. But if it's just transporting things and going on, then personally, I don't care if somebody mutates after the fact. If it's not validated until it gets to the transmitter or even beyond, then who cares?
Yeah, I'm optimizing. Like personally, I'm trying to optimize for making this type more extensible and more approachable to a wider range of developers in the future, rather than trying to save one person who's doing something really inadvisable anyway from falling into a trap. But
so I hear conflicting things now. Are we basically saying we want this shape, or are we saying we don't care, so we just yield to what Tarek wants, or are we saying we want property?
I'm fine. I'm fine with the original proposal with the constructor argument and the property, but like I guess I have already voiced my concern. I think it's going to bind our hands for the future.
I prefer the setter, but I'm not gonna like die on the hill.
This is what
the
I am
constructor's
not
fine.
I'm not understanding why this will tie our hands in the future. Because like,
you're assuming that there will never be any other advisory property or advisory parameter that doesn't also require the buckets being passed in. And there's nothing I can see in the spec that says that's the case.
It will give us some weird ergonomics where we can't have a constructor that just lets you named past the second parameter, because then we'd have to let you pass no parameters. So it's a little weird, but in the new constructor, it could be declared nullable in the 2-argument constructor. So you'd have to say null, comma.
Yeah, but like we're already contemplating a world where we think this thing has legitimate reason to be null, or otherwise not passed in.
I don't think it is bad. I mean, like imagine we would have to add a string, and we want to allow you to either pass in the string or the buckets. I mean, nothing really prevents us from saying there's a new constructor. Enumerable explicit bucket boundaries is null, and then the string is also marked nullable, because now you can pass in either one. You don't have to pass in the buckets all the time.
And then when the third parameter comes in,
the same deal.
Exactly.
No, if a third comes in, what you do is you add another constructor, you add the third parameter, and you go back to the second one, and you all optionality and hide it. That's the same thing we do with everything of this pattern.
Yeah, and then you end up with 5 constructors, and it's not great. Like, even though it's like kind of okay, and IntelliSense kind of works, if you have 5 constructors with the largest one having like a bunch of default values, it's just like, I would rather have getter setters at that point. Especially when it's like not that bad. Like, it's like, oh, there may or may not be one person who gets burned by mutating this after we start using it.
Well, I'm also thinking of like when I use the ASDO SDK in Visual Studio, and they go absolutely wild with optional parameters to their methods. And on one hand, great, but on the other hand, like there are so many optional parameters and so many different overloads that like the tooltip doesn't even fit on my screen, like telling me what parameters I can pass in. Like I literally need to go to the documentation and read it, because like the tooltip is something like 10,000 pixels wide. I'm like, okay, great.
I mean, but let's be real, right? I think in practice what it means is optional parameters work, for let's say up to 5 or 10, right? Like if you have more than that, something terrible happens. Something terrible has happened. The other thing I would say is it also depends on how large the type names are, because that controls the tooltip size too. And if you have some super nested generics, then you're probably out of luck. However, you're talking about a type here that has 1 parameter today, right? So like if we expect this to have like 20 at some point, then yes, we're setting a bad precedent. If we're optimizing for a case where maybe over the next 5 to 10 years we add 3 more, I actually don't think it matters. Like I think either one will work.
Do we control the spec?
Well, I mean, we're just saying that you can make an educated guess.
Yeah. Well, make an okay. Eric, you're the subject matter expert. Make an educated guess. Let it enlighten us.
And of course, we hold you accountable for that guess.
Okay, so I want just to go back about like, what is the intention of this type in the beginning? So the intention is like to create it and never mutate it. I mean, so, and this, our design should be like for this intention. So I mean, like having the property with the setter again, I mean, like, this is violating the intention of this design. So this is why I don't like to have a setter on it. Yeah, I mean, like the worst is like to have init, and we can push on the people telling like, yeah, I mean, like you have to upgrade to whatever, I mean, the compiler version and use it. I mean, this would be better than having setter on it.
And would you copy if it was init?
Yes, we will copy. Yeah.
I mean, sure. I mean, that's consistent at least.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so we chose the constructor here, I mean, just to avoid to have init because people complained about init. But if we say that,
I think to me init and this pattern here is virtually identical. The only difference here is, I think if you go with the constructor and the property, you get to have different types, right? So you get to accept an iNumable init. I think that makes sense. I think if you have an init property, I don't think you want to copy. Like I think that at that point you assign something. So if we say we want to expose an IRead only list, you take an IRead only list and you don't care what type it is. You just store the type as it.
But still, users, I mean, who user hold to this collection can mutate it.
That's correct.
Right?
Yeah,
so don't. Like literally document. If doctor, it hurts when I do this, we'll stop doing that. Like,
like personally, I don't like init the feature because it makes you use the object initializer expression, even though there's just still a public setter. And call it from public reflection, not private reflection. So I think it's just a half implemented feature that I half despise. That's just in general, not in context here. But yeah, I think that given that Tarek wants to protect data integrity, this is the right pattern. Framework design guideline says don't have settable collection properties, makes this the right pattern. Like, I think we just ship this and move on.
Yeah, I'm prepared to do that. I think we spent enough time on it. Why is it a half feature? Why is init like now with required?
Because you can set it via reflection.
Because it's still a publicly settable property to the runtime. It doesn't understand the notion of init.
I see. Yeah,
that was
particularly
explicitly
if you're
designed
doing like naive reflection.
So that things like the XML serializer can generate code that sets properties because it can't generate the collection or the object initialization pattern.
Yeah. All right. I was about to scoff of like anything's possible with reflection, but I get your point. Like a naive deserialization algorithm.
Yeah, or just IL.
Those. Yeah.
It is a property that is settable. So I've never liked the ergonomics of that feature. And required plus init means it should have just been a constructor.
I mean, in fairness, the fact that Jeremy never really moved off of like C# 1.1 syntax makes backporting stuff really, really easy. So I'm willing to back him up on that.
I like whatever language version we added auto properties to. I think that was 3.
Excellent.
C# 3, really good update. There may even be stuff all the way up through like 6. After that, it starts getting iffy.
So what you're really saying is you live in the past, but it's a sliding window. You're only like about 10 years behind.
My musical tastes have almost always been 20 years behind. If a song is less than 20 years old, I don't like it. Once it passes 20 years, it's like a good wine. It's now drinkable, and after it's like 30, now it's good.
That means in 15 years you're gonna like Taylor Swift.
Yeah,
I might eventually like Taylor Swift.
just one last question before we move here. I mean, like changing the default parameters as we did here, I mean, is not a breaking change, right? I mean, like
No,
Correct.
that is the
yeah.
So the intent here is to make it non-breaking, right? Because basically,
Yeah.
the idea is that we make it unambiguous in the source, right? At runtime, I mean, yes, you can imagine somebody using reflection and be broken by the fact that we moved optionality, but that's
Okay.
you know,
Yeah,
we
I
think
mean,
that's fine.
That's good.
It's an
Okay.
approved pattern, yeah. All right, next one.
Yeah, this is me. I hope it will be easier.
No.
Okay.
Approved.
Thank you. Okay, so we have the activity source. This activity source is a class which is used to create activity, which is used for tracing. And while creating the activity source today, we have just to provide like a name and version. And the ask here is to add also tags to it. So you can add tags to the activity source. And the reason for that is they want to stick like, some tags to the activity source that can apply to all activities that get created from this source. Instead of like adding this tag to every activity get created from this, you add it just once here as like a namespace for it, and it can be used for all activities that like get created from this activity source. We have exactly the similar pattern we did in meter. I mean in metrics. So meter class, which is its equivalent to the activity source here, which is also, I mean, like we added tags to it like last release. So we are doing the same here for the activity source. So basically, we have a new constructor which is taking the tags, taking the tags, and we have a properties that you can retrieve these tags that get passed to it, and that's it.
And then same question: the reason why pass in the version if you tags? Probably not.
Not necessarily. I mean, actually, from the usage, I saw most users actually not passing versions.
I would suggest we do.
Yeah, this makes sense.
One parameter, move the default.
Working in another window here.
Yes.
Excellent.
All right, so this.
This sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Okay, we already have the string only constructor.
Yeah. Yes.
And I assume the tags property is just going to be like it is on the other metrics classes. It gets basically two list called on it and then sorted or whatever.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. Sounds good.
right. Oh, Jeremy, yours, I think. Christoph.
Hey, yeah, so Windows have added a new feature, and which is somewhere between the software keys and the TPM, basically makes it safer, I guess. And yeah, like this is adding the new flags in the CNG creation options to match those features. So basically, the way you enable this feature is by passing some flags to the Win API, and we already have the enum, and adding that enum flags in the corresponding .NET enum. Yeah.
And remind me, CNG is Windows only already, right? CNG is the
Yep.
native crypto
Yeah.
stack in Windows.
This is Windows only. I mean, theoretically you can use it, but it's meaningless.
Yeah. Nothing that starts with CNG works on non-Windows aside from you can talk about the enums.
Yeah.
But the classes are all auto PNSE. Actually, it's not true. I don't think we use the auto tool. The classes are PNSE on every other platform.
Yeah.
So
but,
those types doesn't exist in Linux? Or what? I mean,
They
What's that?
exist because we don't have a mismatched shape. But if you say CNG key.open, it'll throw a platform not supported exception because CNG doesn't exist on Linux.
It's like the registry. So is VBS VBScript, or is that something else?
virtualization based security.
Yeah, it's in the title. I don't like the name they picked, but I'm not the one who made it.
Yeah, so I don't like. I have a comment at the bottom. I don't like any of the new names, but I don't have better names. So hopefully somebody does.
So that's basically crypto defined, right?
This is, yeah. I mean, I'll be snarky against the home team. It's Windows API and crypto combined together, so it's the worst of all brevity.
Well, at least we didn't call it DW prefer VBS.
Yeah, this technology that Windows has had, and Windows has had it for quite some time. It came in like Windows 8, but virtualization-based security is the name that kind of stuck across all the different names that they were experimenting with. So you'll see VBS, for better or worse, used throughout the documentation.
Yeah. So I mean, it has the advantage of, because Christoph shared the flag in the encrypt header. It looks like the encrypt flag without the prefix and suffix.
Yeah.
But all three of these names, I think, are, you know what it does and when you need to do it, or it's unapproachable. And I don't. Yeah. We can say prefer virtualization-based security, but now the enum name is a line long, and you still don't know what virtualization-based security is. It just gives you something better to Google. Sorry, Bing.
I mean, that's kind of my...
It's Copilot now.
I mean, that's my only kind of like view on this, is that I would generally say we should align the names so that you can look up the underlying docs. If you Google VBS, you will find something. You will probably not find the thing you're looking for unless you prefix it with crypto, in which case you probably find it. So I think it's still.
And as Christoph has here in the notes, like, this matches the pattern that's already present in this enum, which means it's locally consistent, which we do value.
For what it's worth, searching CNG space VBS of the top 1, 2, 3, 4 of the top 5 hits, 4 of them are correct, and the other one is really interesting. The curvature of CNG and VBS hydrogels in ambient air something.
Nice.
So it is.
There's a.
It is domain relevant, but it is in and of itself not informative.
Yeah. There's a question in chat real fast, which I'll just say for the stream too. So CNG is the Windows, as was answered in chat, Windows Crypto Next Generation, divided largely into 2 different header files, 2 different subsystems, bcrypt and encrypt. Bcrypt by and large is like, here are some primitives, you use them and process the key materials in proc array. And encrypt is the thing that kind of abstracts away where the key is. So encrypt allows you to talk about keys that are in an HSM in another process, maybe on a different machine, like a cloud, key vault, stuff like that. So that's kind of the distinguishing factor between the two. Like where is the actual key material if it's not with me, encrypt?
bcrypt is an implementation of the suite B cryptography specification, and then all the things they've added to it since then. And N stands for storage.
Yes. Yes, it does.
As long as the N doesn't stand for security, it's fine.
Nope, stands for storage. It's where stored keys, whether it's local file system, HSM, virtualization-based security, N stands for storage.
Yeah, but that's also why this particular feature is under encrypt rather than bcrypt, because the key is being stored external to your process. It's even being stored external to the local OS kernel. Like it's being stored in a place where not even the kernel can get access to it. So
unless you say prefer and it's not virtual hosting.
Yeah.
Christoph, do we need is there a corresponding flag that we need to expose somewhere off of CNG key that says that it lives in VBS? Are we missing a description of what happened to it?
I am not sure what you mean.
So on CNG key, we have a property like is machine key, which reflects the machine key creation property.
So, I haven't seen like a way to query to ask for that.
Okay.
I mean, I can guess with the checking the properties maybe, but I wouldn't like it doesn't seem to be documented.
Okay, that's fine then.
Yeah, we can always add it in the future if there is a new property to get it.
Yep.
I swear there was a way programmatically to detect, but maybe it wasn't exposed publicly. So. Oh well.
All right, so then let's talk about tokenizer, because we haven't done this in a long time. So last time we said we want to finish the remainder of this. Steven isn't here.
Yeah, I was going to ask, are we going to need Tog?
Should we postpone this then and just do something else? I mean, there's still other issues we could talk about. Eric is here, so we could talk about the JSON stuff, for example, which is sizable.
Yeah, I'm available if you want to chat.
Eric, is that okay if we postpone the tokenizer one then?
Yeah, that's fine. We can, but we need to have it like next week or so, or Thursday. I don't know.
Yeah, we can book it for Thursday. Like I mean, the problem is like this week is build and Steven is at build, and I think we want to have him here. But we can probably worst case we set up something out of the ordinary like Friday or something.
That's fine.
All right, then,
that's fine.
Oh, my website is yeah.
Your website is perfect.
You just have to hit a refresh. Blazer for the win. Here we go.
All right. So this is just a bunch of missing APIs that are currently internal in the contract model in system.json. They have come up as a requirement for the library to be able to export JSON schemas from these contract types, go through this mishmash of things that you're seeing in the diff. So I think the main requirement that we have for the moment is to be able to extract attribute metadata, arbitrary attribute metadata from the contract. So if you're describing a JSON property info, you want to be able to read attribute information from the underlying member info. If you're examining a constructor parameter, you want to be able to read attribute metadata from the corresponding system.reflection.parameter info, and so on and so forth. In the case of the reflection-based serializer, that's trivial. In the case of SourceGen, not so much. So if you could scroll down just a bit, I can try to show how the proposed solution would be able to extract metadata in the case of the source generator. So in this final code block here, you can see that the source generator would effectively emit a delegate that extracts the relevant member info or parameter info using an inlined reflection expression. So this would ensure that the linker wouldn't trim away the relevant metadata, and it would also make sure that this is only used in cases where users actually exercise these APIs. So it would get trimmed away if not being used, and it would also not enforce any reflection-based APIs being exercised unless in the regular serialization scenario. So that's the basic idea. The API proposal basically proposes a bunch of func of iCustom attribute providers. Any objections to kind of the high-level description or any questions?
I was about to ask why you're using reflection, but you're actually returning. This is get custom attributes, basically, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Since that part's off screen, I was like, why is the generator not just saying return the property? Like, why would it go through the reflection? But okay, never mind. Moving on.
Okay, so that's the basic idea. So if you could scroll back up to the proposal as such. So it's exposing an attribute provider on JSON type info corresponding to the deserialization constructor in case one is being used. It's exposing a new class called JSON parameter info. That type has been internal up to today, and it's being used to determine information, for example, the default value of the constructor parameter, and of course, attribute provider information. That particular type would be read-only at this point. There are plans to potentially make this mutable and make it part of the mutable contract customization APIs, but for now, it's just going to be a read-only thing for the purposes of extracting JSON schema. Again, JSON parameter info is just mimicking the APIs that you would find in system.reflection.parameter info, essentially. And that would be exposed on the JSON property info as the associated parameter info property. That's it, more or less. Are there any questions based on what you're seeing on the screen?
Kind of. So you're exposing it as iCustom attribute provider. Are you not just something more strongly typed?
Like member info or parameter info?
Like, I guess, because I mean, iCustom attribute provider, right? Basically just, there's a method get custom attributes and it returns an object array, right? The expectation is that this is the instantiated custom attributes themselves. Which, isn't great because, I don't know, it kind of implies that it's all reflection based, which it wouldn't be, right? This is all source generator stuff, then presumably you would have something else behind the scenes.
No, the source generator would still be returning system.reflection objects, but it would be surfacing it as an iCustom attribute provider. Now, the reason why I chose the interface here rather than the individual concrete types is that there is prior art. If you take a look at the JSON property info class, it already contains an attribute provider property, which is gettable and settable, and that property usually holds the member info that corresponds to the JSON property info only for the case of the reflection-based serializer today. And for the case of the source generator, it's reported as null.
Gotcha.
The idea would be that this would become consistent for both the source-generated worlds and the reflection-based worlds.
So I guess my question is, like, how does somebody use that? Like, is the expectation they just call get custom attributes, they get a bunch of objects, they cast them to some of the well-known JSON attributes, and then they're party on those?
Well, just to give you an idea of kind of the key use case we're looking at. The key use case is OpenAPI. So OpenAPI want to be able to extract a JSON schema from these objects. But in order for them to be able to do that, they want to be able to resolve component model attributes, for example. So description attribute is, a key facet of,
Gotcha.
schema-like representations. But we couldn't take a dependency on description attribute in system text JSON. So it's basically something that we delegate to the consumer of these APIs to, go nuts and resolve whatever attribute they require.
Gotcha. So it is actually, like, by definition open-ended. I thought it's more, so what I meant by strongly typed was I would have expected to surface whatever JSON specific attributes are as an API, but you're saying, no, this is for your own attributes. If you have your own validation attributes on that or whatever, right, you can expect those and do something. Yeah, that makes sense.
For the things that JSON understands, like it already maps to strongly typed features anyways.
That makes sense.
And maybe I missed it, but the adding disallow null on JSON parameter info values doesn't seem related to everything else you talked about? Or is it just like a place you weren't surfacing that value?
Yeah, that was something that got missed in the other nullable reference type API proposal. So adding it back here for posterity.
Fair enough.
And then presumably JSON parameter info should be sealed, right?
Yes, it should be.
I guess it does makes no difference because there's no public constructor.
Well, as listed, it does have a public constructor because it doesn't say it has a non-public constructor.
Well, it depends on what you expect to see here. Like I always think of it as what is the actual public API, not just the compiler, but
right. If there's a non-public constructor, show up in the ref. But...
Yep. So then, question I had.
Well, while Emo's thinking of that, there's a back reference from the property info to the parameter info, and that's how you get the parameter info, right? There's no way to get the parameter info by itself, and then you need to somehow discover a forward reference from that to the property info, right?
Not at the moment, and the reason for that is that the JSON public contract APIs don't let you customize parameterized constructors today. They only let you. It's not possible. So what happens is that under wraps the parameter infos will be joined with the property infos based on some matching logic, and you would be able to read that off your property info.
Yeah, it's a bit weird, but it kind of makes sense. I guess my question is regarding this, like, info values thing, like, what do they represent?
So JSON parameter info values is, and all of the types that have the editor browsable.never annotations, these are the kind of OG contract APIs that were added back in .NET 6 and are only used by the source generator. They effectively duplicate. They're essentially property bags that are being fed into kind of the main contract types. So it's basically, so JSON parameter info values already has all these things that you're seeing in JSON parameter info. It has a parameter type, it has a has default value, it has a, it doesn't have an attribute provider, but these are only kind of fed into the serializer. There's no way for you to actually read back that information at the moment. And the best way to do that is by exposing a separate type, just following the design of all the other contract types.
Yeah, this is where the kind of meme comes in. I have no memories of any of this, so so I guess what I'm struggling with is like this, like, info values suffix. So why is that plural, and like what? I still don't know what it represents. I guess I know what a JSON type info represents. I don't know what a JSON property info values represents.
Yeah, so I wasn't around when these were being reviewed, but I was around. I wasn't in JSON. But effectively, these were being used by the source generator when all the APIs in JSON type info and JSON property info weren't public. But they're kind of they're thin property bags. They only store data. They don't hold implementation. They don't hold caches. They don't hold these types of things.
Yeah, then I guess ignore them for now. So like they're just exposed for consistency then.
Not just for consistency. Like the source generator would still need to feed these delegates into the values types so that they are being consumed by the contract the contract types.
Yep. I guess.
Again, this is navigating history, so there's some complexity just because of that.
Yep. You've not made any changes,
actually,
right?
Sorry, what was that?
We have not made any changes, right, except for making JSON parameter info field, right?
Right. I would like to propose a change which I wanted to make, but then I forgot. I would propose renaming associated parameter info to just parameter info, just out of brevity concerns, I guess.
I mean, I'm fine either way. I mean, there's no ambiguity, right? Still.
I'd go for the shorter one in that case.
Another suggestion could be associated parameter, so just drop the info on there.
Yeah, works. Here. You guys decide what you want to name it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because we have JSON type info.properties. It's not property infos. So I would tend to agree with that.
So which one do you want then? Associated parameter or just parameter or?
Parameter. Let's say associated parameter.
Right. Easy enough.
Yep. Can I ask a question about the factories real fast?
No.
The factory is because you want to perform the property info lookup lazily, correct?
Correct.
Who's going to be querying this property? Is the property only ever going to be used by source generator? Oh, you said it's going to be used by people who are interested in getting schemas for this, right?
Correct. So what would happen effectively is that delegate would get cached by the JSON property info, and if you were to exercise the attribute provider property, then it would lazily instantiate that and cache it for you.
Yeah, that's why I was curious. Like we now have two things that can kind of be nullable here, right? There's the delegate itself, and then there's the thing that the delegate returns, which means that you now need to use like you now need to start chaining like $.invoke stuff like that, and we're guaranteeing that the func is like memoizing and caching the return value.
No.
So is that something that consumers are going to have to be aware of, the fact that the func could return different values every time?
So the users, regular users, shouldn't have to deal with the func. The func is provided by the source generator. It's being fed into JSON property info instances and JSON parameter info instances. They call that delegate and cache the resultant value. So
is that JSON object info values as well editor browsable never, or is it public?
They're all editor browsable never.
Yeah,
I just removed it because they're existing types, yeah.
Okay. I guess what I'm wondering is, like, are we exposing basically like too much of the source generator infrastructure to people who care about querying these things?
Yes, but that's the design point.
Yes, but it should only be editor browsable.never. But yeah, these are APIs that have crossed the threshold of immortality, and there's nothing we can do about that.
Okay, fair. Well, it was the factories very specific. Curious about.
Yeah. Users shouldn't have to deal with them with these. Like they should be invisible unless they go through the generated source.
Works for me.
Sweet.
Could I shoehorn another item, which is very much related to this one?
Sure.
Okay, so I just shared a link in chat. Would you mind opening that, please? It's not a Rickroll.
Emo gets reminded how hard it is to look at chat when you're hosting the stream.
Okay, so apologies. This is not like an API proposal in the formal sense, but this is something that I did send over at FXDC. It is something that I'm looking to get merged before PV5 snaps tomorrow. So just wanted to discuss this with you guys here. So basically, David and me have been working on the implementation of the nullable reference type annotations feature. If you recall, when we approved the API shape a few weeks ago, we kind of went for the breaking change approach, where we make this the default behavior, i.e. the serializer would be enforcing nullable reference type annotations on properties. Now, me and David kind of found out that this was very disruptive. We had, thousands of tests failing. We got a very strong signal that, things would be breaking substantially. And, the web being the web, I'm sure tons of people currently rely on the fact that the serializer will happily deserialize null for properties that are otherwise annotated as being non-nullable in C# code. So we want to change course. We want to make the ignore nullable annotations to we want to flip the defaults basically and make it an opt-in feature. But at the same time, we feel that this would necessitate changes in naming and also some changes in the semantics of the properties on JSON property info. So I would propose renaming the ignore nullable annotations property as approved from JSON serializer options, so that it's now called respect nullable annotations, and that would default to false. And that would make it sit well with the respect required constructor parameters that we also approved a few weeks back.
Just a quick note here about in the tokenizers, we use the word consider instead of respect. So we can call this like consider nullable annotation. But just to mention.
Okay. The other respect hasn't been implemented yet, so if people in this room feel that consider is better, then we can rename both.
Can I ask a question here? Is this allow null rights kind of like that means that we will throw basically like when you try to get the property or like basically like suggest the action during the serialization, like while this seems like the new name seems like more like a query, like during the.
Correct. Yep.
So like how should you, like, why is this settable in that case?
Okay, so the problem is that by making the behavior opt-in, it actually means that with the design that we approved a few weeks ago, the disallow null writes and disallow null reads kind of suggest a behavior, but that would remove crucial metadata that we need for the JSON schema extraction layer. So the proposal is to replace these with is get non-nullable and is set non-nullable, which would just denote annotation, but they wouldn't denote behavior. The behavior would be governed exclusively by the global flag, i.e. respect nullable annotations.
I see. So I can still have this thing set to false, and then is get non-nullable will still say, yep, you marked it as non-nullable.
Yep. Basically.
That makes sense.
And what state is the property in a nullable disable library?
So it in a nullable oblivious type or member, it would just reflect whether the particular property is nullable or not. So the default of T is null.
So if it is in a nullable agnostic context, it will return a Boolean value indicating if it's a reference type.
Yes, with handling for nullable.
Fair enough.
So that one is interesting. So, I mean, you could consider a design where you actually expose that, but I'm not sure that's very useful.
Okay, so if nullability is on, you're going to say what the nullability answer is, and if nullability is off, it's would the C# language allow you to write the word null?
Sure.
Which is nullable of T and all reference types.
And like, would it make sense to drop the non part from the name, like, because like currently like it requires a lot of like thinking to which is it nullable or is it not?
Yeah, I was about to say it's in fact the opposite of what I just that non-nullable in the middle.
Yeah, I would avoid that because double negation is.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and also it works better when approaching this from the schematization world, like where you don't care if something is non-nullable, you care if something is nullable.
The only thing I don't like, and I think that's unfortunately a thing that we cornered ourselves with the design, is like what happens when you get a JSON property info for an int question mark.
You said that's nullable.
So that's nullable. And also, all the attributes that come with the NRT feature, the language feature, allow null, disallow null, maybe null, not null, they also work with nullable of T properties and nullable of T parameters. So correspondingly, this feature would have support for corresponding nullable of T annotations.
So what you're saying is it is actually what people would expect it to. Nullable reference types, it's for all sort of nullability information.
Correct.
That's nice. Okay, then my only suggestion would be, I mean, I'm fine with respect nullable annotations. If I turn this off, does this change any behavior with respect to nullable of T?
Yes, it should do. Only for nullable of T's that have some of the attributes, because question mark has different meaning in nullable of T. So right. it wouldn't. Yeah.
I mean,
it's kind of a niche.
So what happens today, like before this feature, if you have a customer that has a property of type int and the payload sets that to null, what do? You throw, or you say set it to 0?
It should have no bearing.
You just ignore it?
There's no... the changing the respect nullable annotations shouldn't have impact.
I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out. But you know what the current behavior is?
So the scenario would be you have a property that's int question mark and nothing else.
Well, so my question is so before we added this feature, right, to respect nullable reference types and notations, right? There's some behavior that we have today with respect to you know, when you pass in null in the payload, and the receiving property is either marked as non-nullable because, you know, it's just an int, or is nullable in question mark, right? I would assume today if you try to set null to an int, you fail, right?
Oh, that's an exception, yes.
Yeah. And then presumably when you set this property here, it won't change that behavior because it's just a type system thing. You just can't put it in there, right?
Correct.
That's the only thing that's slightly confusing with this but I don't know how we separate like nullable reference types and notations from nullable of t meaningfully. That's what I meant earlier. Like we made this the same thing, right? But they're not the same thing, so you get different behavior. So that's kind of
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
the way things are.
It's kind of painful, but it's the way it is.
Yep. Right. So then I think the only changes we set was we want to have respect nullable annotations. We want to leave that as the name. We want to switch to something else.
I mentioned this in chat. I do kind of like respect a little bit more than consider, because consider doesn't have the full weight of enforcement behind it, whereas respect does.
Yeah, consider to me seems a bit weak. I would.
Too polite.
Yes, I mean respect is polite, right? We're all being respectful here.
The Dawn demands respect.
Yes.
But
I do like the idea that respect does convey enforcement. Saying Nemo.
Oh no, it's like there's a Europop song. All respect. RESPCT.
Oh, by
I
thought you were going to refer to the Erasure song. Yeah.
No. So then and then we call it is get nullable. Is set nullable.
And is nullable.
Presumably we will never support out parameters, right?
Not supported there.
So would this feature false for nullable oblivious stuff? Sorry, friends.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So for JSON property info dot is get nullable is set nullable. If you read that on like a nullable oblivious assembly or type.
In is get nullable in a nullable oblivious context would just reflect the nullability of the underlying CLR type.
So generally true.
So it would
For objects.
if default of t is null, it would be equal to default of t is null.
Yeah. Okay.
Basically, if you look at any framework method called is nullable, it would have the same implementation as all of those, because those methods don't consider annotations at all. They only ask like, are you a value type, and if so, are you nullable of t? And beyond that, they don't really care.
Right. Like I guess that's the only sensible answer if all you have is a bool. Of course, there are the APIs that return like an unu, which will tell you if it's like oblivious. But yeah.
I mean, to be fair, I've about nullable of t. My question earlier was, is it just returning whether or not it's a reference type? But I missed nullable of t. Yeah, so in a nullable oblivious, it's would the C# language allow you to write equals null semicolon?
Precisely.
So I think this was a huge improvement on the design.
And so did any of the existing Net9 previews ever ship with nullability turned on by default? Nullable enforcement?
No. This is no implementation has been merged yet.
Okay.
Yeah, it makes me sad, but it is what it is.
It's going to break the universe, and I think ASP.NET would see failing tests as well, like we did. So it was gonna be a nightmare to react to.
But
yeah, I mean,
isn't
it's consistent
that,
with the rest.
But I mean, devil's advocate here, isn't that an indication that their tests were written in a fragile fashion?
Well, I mean, with our unit tests, like you intentionally want to simulate, bad scenario. So, doing null bang everywhere is kind of what you do. But I've seen how nullable reference types annotations are being used in the wild, and I know that people will be bitten by this. I think it's a nice feature if you're working on a greenfield project and you're handling your nullable reference type annotations perfectly, but yeah.
The thing that's going through my mind right now is if I need to change the internal corporate guidance to always set this flag to true for all of the apps and services that we write. But we'll figure it out.
I mean, this is kind of the problem of this design, and it's it's more or less the same problem we have with the project file as well, right? You have to set it in the project file if you want the behavior, because the default is it's off. You already have to opt in at the project level for the same reason, because we believe it's too disruptive to have it on.
Can I globally change the default? So we're leaving it defaulting to false, right? But can I use an app context switch to be like, yes. I want it true? Yeah.
Yes. But I mean, that would be impacting, any library that you're referencing that also uses system.json. They would be,
right.
You would be affecting that change to them as well. So,
that's what I want.
Be that.
But yeah, no, I mean, that's why I asked, right? Is just so I could do that if I am in a greenfield project. It might not work depending on the library, but
I mean, we have this new feature that is coming, I think, in .NET 9, in fact, is like to have some sort of project level, SDK level inheritance, right? Because the problem in the project file today is every time we have a new opt-in setting, the project file grows. What they're trying to do is they try to basically put in the version number in the project file with the intent that if you do file new project, you get what we consider the good defaults because it's a greenfield project. You don't have to say nullable enable because you're targeting a later version of the SDK, so you get it on by default, right? But then when you just take an existing project and you just change the framework to the latest version, you still target the old version of the SDK, so you get the old default. And so in that world, maybe we want to live in a world where the new version of the SDK at some point says, you know what, you want JSON serialization to honor reference types by default. And instead of being an app context switch that you have to set programmatically, maybe it comes from the MS build and is somehow passed into the generator, and that sets it to. Because I would
kind of like
that you want kind of for greenfield, you kind of want it on. Problem is just when you're not in greenfield, it's disruptive and it's on by default. Right?
It's kind of like LAN version, but for the SDK.
It kind of like, so I think the original design that I saw is that there was a new project level attribute in the project file. So instead of saying SDK : it would be inherits equals blah, and then you would get in that string there was a version number basically. I'm not sure that's the current behavior that they have, but like that's the intent was to say if you create a brand new project with .NET 10, we no longer have to put in like 10 properties in your project file.
It's so frustrating because I start off every project by deleting all those properties.
Yeah, I do too. I don't want I don't want
implicit
level statements.
I don't want top level statements. I don't want nullability. I don't want any of it.
Yeah, but you're the same kind of people that turn off all the UI improvements that comes with a new version of Windows. So you may not.
If they ever improve the UI, I would be happy. They don't improve the UI; they make it crappier every time.
Yeah.
And now I've said that on the recording. So, and this is so if respect is set to true, just going back to Levi asking, do we care about guidance for partner teams? Respect is set to true. It means you'll automatically block null assignment when the metadata says it shouldn't allow it. That's the only behavior the top level Boolean has, right?
Correct.
Okay, so in that sense, I don't know that it matters to internal guidance. It's you might get nulls, but you might get nulls anyway. Like you can declare a property as string and not string question mark, and like null can still get assigned. If you don't want null, you have to check for it.
By the way,
it can get assigned if you like say equals null bang.
Right.
Or you assign it from a nullable agnostic context.
Right, but if generally speaking though, like if we're talking about applications which have opted into nullability,
sure.
like it's probably safe to say it's done pretty much everywhere.
Yes, for applications you probably have it's either on or like it's on or off for your application, but library developers, just because you turn it on doesn't mean your callers did.
Yeah, but like I'm still having trouble wrapping my mind around the fact that like as somebody who has created a model that you're passing into a deserializer, like you went out of your way to make sure that the model had nullable annotations on it, and then you're surprised when things break.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying,
like
setting it on gives you some throws for free. Having it off means there might be some nulls that manifest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
those same nulls could manifest if you said new, and you're in a nullable agnostic context. So,
I mean, in this, it's basically the parameter bang feature, except for serialization, right? You just get the null checks for free, but like everything else is the same. By the way, like, do you do anything on the outgoing side? If I serialize and I lied, you don't throw, right?
Yeah.
Or
Is get nullable is
that's where it was previously disallowed null rights.
So like if I serialize something that is where the instance is null, even though the annotation says it shouldn't be, serialize will then throw with sorry you lied.
Right. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay.
One thing to consider is, would we want separate flags for serialization and deserialization? But I think that might be overcomplicating things.
I mean, you could imagine a world of people, because with the other feature that you have, right, where you can say do not emit null properties, right, into the document. You could imagine that somebody would want that behavior. But I don't know.
I mean, if there's demand, we can, I think, add separate global properties after the fact. It's going to be weird, but
I mean, it kind of depends on how you want to think about it, right? So like if you have a lot of array properties, right, it would make sense to say, I don't want to serialize those as empty arrays. So I don't know how you do this in JSON. You probably would have to say, the property that returns the array is null, and then I said the, don't emit null things. That's the only thing I can think about, but I think though, if you throw by default, the nice thing is people will find out, right? And then they will file the bug and say, hey, I really want to just ignore them. I don't want to send them. But
there is an ignore setting, by the way. I think it's called ignore null values or something. And it takes precedence over that, over the non-nullable reference annotations.
Oh, hold on. So if I set this to true, then if I lied, then if I say this is a non-nullable array and then it's actually null, but I set the other setting that says don't send it, then you just ignore it rather than blowing up with an exception.
Yeah.
Well, in that case, that seems like that's then the feature people. Yeah, I mean that seems reasonable then. At that point, it's like, yeah, you only blow up if you would have to serialize a payload that says :NULL, right? Yeah, I mean that.
Oh, because you won't be able to read it. It won't round trip.
Exactly, right? Yeah, so that
Yep.
that seems very reasonable to me, honestly. And get all the behaviors that you could possibly want.
Yep.
Is that kind of how you justify that behavior? You're trying to avoid generating something that you know won't round trip properly?
Correct. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, the internal guidance stuff doesn't really matter for this conversation. It's just kind of a fun thing to mull over, because I'm still, like I mentioned earlier, having trouble wrapping my mind around the head that it's not actually indicative of a bug in your code. Like that you've said I want this, but now it has all these other consequences. Well, it's like, well, that's what you asked for. Like,
or Levi, you work at Microsoft and you're confused by the fact that people have cognitive dissonance all the time. It's a I don't know, I'm so used to this.
Yeah.
I wanted it secure, but I also wanted it convenient. Also, I don't
well,
know how to
that's the thing, right? Like I'm having a lot of trouble making this as a security argument. If it were, it would be a lot easier for me. Yeah. Because people can do some really gnarly stuff here with serialization, but there are other things I want to focus my efforts on, not this.
Yeah, nulls are not the thing that will kill your server, probably.
Not in C#, certainly.
All right, so then anything else? I think we did a lot today. So how important is your binary payloader? Does anybody know? The binary format payload reader?
I mean, it's important, but Adam's not here right now.
I'm just thinking, if this is 2 weeks out, is that okay, or does it have to be by next week as well?
I mean, the true answer is I'll find out tomorrow because I have a meeting with Steve, and I don't know if Jock will be there, but we'll find the real schedule tomorrow. But the schedule as written says the commitment date is preview 7.
And that is next week.
Now that's
in a month, I think. The 5 snap is tomorrow.
5 is tomorrow, so 6 is a month, so 7 is 2 months.
Oh yeah, okay then. Okay, that's fine. So then, yeah, the tokenizer is still the most urgent thing then, and then get to them. Cool.
I mean, we want to be able to consume the reader internally, even well ahead of preview snap. But yeah.
Hast du ein Wurzelsendes Hammer, Himo?
I do not know. I don't have a hammer. I only have a virtual hammer. All right, then goodbye everyone. I see you Thursday probably.
Bye everyone.
Is there a meeting this Thursday?
If I set it up, yeah.
If you set it up. Sure.